The peripheral nervous system is going to include both your somatic, or what we call motor nervous system, and the autonomic. So this is voluntary versus involuntary. And it's going to include your cranial nerves and your spinal nerves, as we mentioned, connecting into the central nervous system. So cranial nerves, as you might expect, arise from your brain, but are not your brain. And spinal nerves arise from your spinal cord, but are not spinal cord. Okay? They are separate, they are different. And when we look at these cranial and spinal nerves, remember, nerves are just bundles of nerve fibers. We've got to think about each one of these as being an individual neuron that's conducting information. And we've got to deal with that as far as bringing in sensory information and sending out some sort of response, whether that be to skeletal muscle here, blood vessels, any type of glands that you have that need response, all of these things. You have 12 pairs of cranial nerves and 31 pairs of spinal nerves. I don't care that you know what these are. You know that. But what I do want you to see is they are, of course, all named and labeled, and we know what a lot of them do. And we look for this integration of, in your brain, directly to the facial features. So when we look at cranial nerves, we're looking at olfactory, which is nose. We're looking at eyes, jaw, taste buds, ears, pharynx, so throat, right? Tongue. And then we finally get these last two that go to the rest of your body. So these are ones that are going to be involved in going to neck and back muscles and to and from internal organs, so in particular looking at heart and lungs, diaphragm, and so on. When we look at spinal cord and the spinal nerves coming off of it, we have to think about where all of those have to go. And at the base of our spinal cord, we get some very, very long nerves that run the entire length of your leg in many cases. So we've got a lot of information that has to be sent out in these peripheral nerves through the information from your central nervous system, and we send it out through the spinal cord. So remember the difference between dorsal and ventral? So dorsal is back and ventral is front, right? As far as direction on your body. So the dorsal root actually brings in information. So the dorsal is sensory, and the ventral sends out the response. So we talked about affector versus effector cells. And this is what they're targeting. The idea is that we're bringing in all the sensory information into the back of your spinal cord and sending a response out the front. I don't care if you're wiggling your finger or signaling to make insulin. The response and the pathways for this response are very similar. When we talk about the somatic nervous system, we're focusing on skeletal muscles. Okay, this is voluntary response, and this is typically to an external stimulus. When we look at autonomic or automatic, right, this is an internal environment response, stimulus and response, because its job is to regulate homeostasis. So we've got to find some way to keep everything in balance. We'll focus on smooth muscle, cardiac muscle, and any of your body system organs. Everything you don't have voluntary control over. So voluntary, motor system, to and from skeletal muscles. Some of these will be involuntary in the sense that we're responding to a stimulus that we haven't thought about. Okay? You burn yourself, you step on something sharp. These are all involuntary responses. You're trying to get away from the damage. It's not something you sit and think about. Autonomic are involuntary, cardiac and smooth and so on, as we mentioned. We break that down even further into what we call parasympathetic. So this is your restful state. Sympathetic, so this is your fight or flight response that we talked about. And then enteric, which are associated with your digestive system. So we actually break these down into the categories so that we can better deal with what's going on. They're under different types of control. So parasympathetic essentially is conserving energy and stay awake enough to be able to respond to your environment. Sympathetic, this is high energy use. Because remember, sympathetic is fight or flight. So you're going to have to respond to something. And both of those will actually tie into your enteric or your digestive system. Because if you need to conserve energy, you're going to be looking at storing sugars. If you are in a fight or flight response, you're going to be looking at converting and using sugars very, very rapidly. So there are differences. Parasympathetic versus sympathetic. So rest versus fight or flight. So how do we look at differences here? Well, you can look down through this, but what we want to think about is things like dilating your pupils under fight or flight. So dilate means to open up, right? So we're going to increase the amount of light coming into your eye. We're relaxing the bronchi, which means we should be able to increase oxygen-carbon dioxide exchange. We're increasing your heart rate, so we're getting better blood flow and blood circulation. Stimulating glucose release, so we're going to increase sugar to ATP conversion. All these things are critical for you to be able to fight. But if you're at rest, we're going to slow your heart rate. We're going to slow down your breathing. We're going to actually stimulate your digestive system to do digestion. This is different in that we're looking for your digestive system to actually do something like store sugars now while we're at rest and while we can.